Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Third Thursday with GBLA. We appreciate you taking the time today to join us. This month is April, and which is also known as National Fair Housing Month. So here today we have one of our GBLA Fair Housing Law Project attorneys, Bashar, and he's going to go over a presentation about some fair housing information that you should be aware of, different types of protected categories and so forth, and then we'll kind of dive in a little bit into services that we offer here at GBLA. Quick introduction of myself. My name is Cassie Mulliken. I am the Marketing and Communications Coordinator here at GBLA. Just need to let you know that this recording, this webinar is recorded. It will be posted to our social media channels and our website at a later date for viewing. Question and answers or questions can be done either at the end of the program during our Q&A session, or you can type in your question in the question box, the chat box, or raise your hand. All attendees are currently muted at this time. So when it comes time to questions, we can go and go from there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and launch the presentation and pass the reins over to Bashar.
All right, thank you, Cassie. Like Cassie said, my name is Bashar Al-Gabiali, and I am an attorney at Greater Bakersfield Legal Assistance in the Fair Housing Law Project unit. And so that's what I'll be discussing today. As Cassie mentioned, I'll be discussing what's fair housing and kind of the law around that, and then what services we provide at GBLA in terms of for fair housing. So so we start off kind of just what is fair housing, and so when we talk about fair housing, really what we're referring to is civil rights in housing. Similar to civil rights in other contexts, fair housing is civil rights in housing. This sometimes gets confused with landlord-tenant law, which refers to issues between landlords and tenants that don't involve any kind of discrimination. But that's not what this is. And so fair housing, it's the right to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination. And so it's for someone to have an equal opportunity to housing without any outside preferences or stereotypes. And like the slide says, in brief, it's the renting, buying, or financing of housing without discrimination as a factor. So that's what we're looking at here. We're talking about discrimination. As Cassie mentioned, this is April is National Fair Housing Month, and that's because the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed in April 1968. It was passed a week after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Exactly a week after that. That event is probably it's what caused the Federal Fair Housing Act to be passed. California, as we'll discuss, has its own fair housing protections that actually predated the federal law. And so when we talk about discrimination in housing, like I said, it's unlawful discrimination based on certain characteristics and what that's called protected classes. And so here is a list of all the protected classes. And so it's treating somebody differently in housing or being discriminated in housing based on one of these categories. So the categories on the left are all of the federal protections. So these are the categories of people or protected classes that are protected under federal law. So it's race. That's the main one. That's kind of the reason why the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed. But there's also many others. There's color, which references protection against discrimination based on someone's skin tone. There's protections for national origin based on someone, which country they came from, religion, sex, which includes gender discrimination, and also sexual harassment and sexual orientation, which we'll get into a little bit later. Discrimination based on disability, both physical and mental. Family status, which refers to households that have at least one minor under 18 in their household. And then in California, we have all those federal protections, but in addition to those, there's also sexual orientation, marital status, ancestry, source of income, which we have a little asterisk there. So that one, it's illegal for housing providers to discriminate against people's where they get their income from. They can still have criteria for the amount of income, but where the income is from, say they try to say like it's they want employment income versus income from SSI or some other source. The asterisk is just recently in the last I believe 2 years, that also includes now housing vouchers. So for instance, like Section 8 vouchers, that's a new addition to California where housing providers cannot say they don't accept Section 8 vouchers as a source of income. There's also medical condition, age, if it's over 40, gender identity and gender expression, immigration status, and then the final one is arbitrary characteristics. So this one is someone can't be discriminated against because of physical things that have no bearing on their ability to pay rent and be a good tenant. So typically examples of this are like, someone who has tattoos or, various other physical characteristics that a landlord is relying on to not rent to that person, but that have no bearing on whether they are able to pay rent and be a good tenant. So that's kind of a catch-all one in California. And so those are the protected categories. And then, excuse me, now we'll talk about what kinds of things are prohibited. So these protections, they apply in really two different contexts. One is when someone is applying for housing, and then the other is when they're already in their current housing. So, excuse me. The main one I think people think of is just the first one, refusing to rent or to sell housing. Just flat out refusing. I'm not going to rent to you. I'm not going to sell you this house. And if the reason can be shown to be it's because of their membership in one of those categories we discussed in the previous slide, then that is housing discrimination. But it's not just refusing to sell or rent. So it's also providing false or misleading information to housing seekers. So someone tries to rent a property, rent an apartment, rent a house, and the housing provider gives them wrong information, or that the place is rented. The rent is a certain amount, which it isn't. Like it's a higher amount than what they're telling other people. Various other information about the rental or the home is false or misleading. That's also illegal. And then the next one is different terms and conditions or policies or rules. So this refers to people who are in their housing. So or people who are obtaining housing, if they're offered different terms or conditions, or there are different rules than other similarly situated people, and it's because of one of those protected categories, and that's also prohibited. Sexual harassment, which I think we'll discuss a little bit more in the following slides. Refusing disability-related reasonable accommodations or reasonable modifications. Again, we'll discuss that a little bit more. Discriminatory advertising or statements. So it's not just their actions and when they deal with people, but it's in housing providers advertising. They can't advertise or state a preference regarding one of the protected categories. So one of the more recent examples of that, especially with like source of income and the addition of Section 8 vouchers, those kind of ads that say no Section 8, those are now illegal because they're stating a preference or they're advertising something that's illegal, because they can't refuse Section 8 vouchers. But it'd be similar to any other category. interference with fair housing rights. So this refers to if you're trying to, if a tenant or trying to assert their fair housing rights, housing providers can't interfere with that. Differential treatment of in-place tenants because of a tenant protected class. So this is basically, this is treating people differently based on their membership in the protected class. So tenants who are already tenants, but they're being treated differently than other tenants. And if it can be shown that that different treatment is because of race or color, national origin, any of the other categories, then that it's unlawful discrimination. A lot of times we see, we get calls from tenants that complaining about, landlords or housing providers of their treatment, and the distinction is if the housing provider is treating everybody badly, or not making repairs, or not doing things to everybody, then that's not really a fair housing issue. It might still be an issue, obviously like a landlord-tenant issue, but what makes it a fair housing issue is if it is different in treatment between tenants, and the reasons for that. Steering in neighborhoods or developments, this is kind of an antiquated term that you don't see very often anymore. What it means is housing providers can't steer applicants to certain neighborhoods or certain parts of a complex based on their membership of a particular class. So sometimes what we see that nowadays is sometimes households with children, housing providers will might try to steer them to maybe like first floor units as opposed to second floor units because of noise complaints and various other things. That's not allowed. The tenant or the prospective tenant gets to choose where they want to apply for, which unit they want to apply for. Discrimination for associating with members of a particular class. So it's not that they're, so this is discrimination based on who a person associates with. So say maybe a landlord doesn't like that you have a friend who's in a wheelchair come over, or doesn't like that you have African-American friends come over. That can also be housing discrimination based on the tenant's association with members. And then retaliation is always housing discrimination that, so if, maybe you file a complaint with a government agency for housing discrimination, or you try to assert your rights to have an emotional support animal or something like that, and then the landlord after that does something like gives you a termination notice or does something to retaliate, that the retaliation is also housing discrimination. And then finally, harassment is prohibited. So, and particularly like all the rest of these, it's harassment towards people because, like I said before, because their membership in a particular class. So it's harassment because of someone's race, or because someone has a disability, or they're one of the other protected categories. And so I think when we talk about fair housing, we reference the examples. We talk about mostly rentals because that's kind of what we see. It's the rental markets, landlords and tenants, but it doesn't only apply to rentals. It applies, as you see when we go through this list of who's covered, you'll notice that it applies to all contexts of the housing industry. So it's from sales, like I said, rentals, the mortgage industry, the insurance market. You could even apply to cities and counties if they make, laws, zoning laws that are discriminatory. So real estate operators, agents, brokers are covered. Listing organizations, builders, developers, condo associations can have liability for fair housing violations. Homeowners who are selling their homes or advertising their homes for sale. Banks, mortgage brokers, appraisers. There's been a lot of work kind of nationally towards the appraisal industry in terms of fair housing. Owners of investment properties, leasing agents, or like rental management companies, and then also insurance companies who sell homeowners or renters insurance. Any of these types of people who are connected to the housing industry can be liable for housing discrimination. So let me just go through a couple of the ones that I highlighted. So sex discrimination is, unfortunately, is a common form of discrimination. And so this one has there's different forms. The first one is quote unquote generic sex discrimination, and we quote generic because it means gender. So this would be similar to any other protected category. It's treating, having different standards or treating people differently based on their gender. But then, like I said earlier, this also includes sexual harassment. And so this is the one that really is more common than the gender sex discrimination. So sexual harassment, there's two types. There's what's called quid pro quo, and so that's Latin for this for that. So it basically is when a housing provider connects a sexual demand or request for a housing benefit. It connects to connected to the housing somehow. So, for example, would be like the housing provider says, like, do this fill in the blank sexual demand in exchange for reduced rent, or in exchange for making some kind of repair, or to avoid an eviction. That's what's called quid pro quo. Do this for me, and then I'll do this for you, which is illegal and illegal housing discrimination. The other one is hostile environment, and so this is where the victim is subject to unwelcome verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that's either severe if it's one incident, or it's extensive if it's something like making comments, verbal sexual statements. So that's hostile environment, sexual harassment. If it's made in the housing context, then it's housing discrimination. And then we have there's also protections for domestic or sexual violence victims, and these protections, basically the theme underlying these protections is that survivors of domestic violence or sexual violence should not be evicted or denied housing or treated differently for reasons that are related to the abuse that they have experienced. Okay, so now I'll talk about a little bit about disability discrimination. Disability discrimination really is the #1 type of cases that we see here at GBLA, as well as complaints that are filed, statewide and nationally. It really is disability discrimination, and in particular, from the disability discrimination, it's reasonable accommodations and modifications. So the general kind of thinking in terms of fair housing is that housing providers should be treating all people equally. But some rules, policies, or practices may have a different impact or effect on persons with disabilities than other persons. And so treating people with disabilities exactly the same as others will sometimes deny them an equal opportunity to enjoy their dwelling or participate in some kind of program. And so with respect to people with disabilities, their housing providers are required to make necessary reasonable accommodations. And so reasonable accommodations, it's a change to housing providers' rule or policy or practice or service that's necessary for the person with a disability to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy their housing. And so this really could be anything. We have some examples here on the slide, but it could be an accommodation request, could be anything that's related to the person's disability, and then it enhances their quality of life by ameliorating some of the effects of disability. So these examples are kind of the common ones. It's waiving a no pets policy or pet deposit. This is kind of the number one thing in this category that we see. So this includes assistance animals, which include service animals, as well as emotional support animals for people with a mental disability. Next example is reassigning parking space or a mailbox. So if a housing provider does not assign parking in a complex, but the person with a mobility impairment needs a parking reserved for themselves that's close to their unit, that's an accommodation that can be requested by that person with a disability. Providing monthly rent payment reminders. Maybe someone who's visually impaired needs documents that the housing provider provides, needs them read out loud. Someone with a person with a mobility impairment that lives upstairs, that now has a mobility impairment that didn't before, they want to move to a downstairs unit, so that's an accommodation that can be requested. And then finally, allowing a live-in aid. So again, if a live-in aid is something that the person with disability needs to ameliorate some of the effects of the disability, then that's something that can be requested. And so these are just examples. Like I said, it could be, these can cover a lot of different requests, and they're not limited to just one request. I do want to add, just on the reasonable accommodations, there is one exception, and it's rare, but it's basically if the accommodation is an undue financial burden to the housing provider, or a fundamental change in the way they're doing business, and that's an exception, but it's like I said, it's rare. And the other thing would be kind of a companion to reasonable accommodations is reasonable modifications. So this refers to its changes to the physical structure of either the inside or outside of a unit or the common areas. And so landlords are required to allow necessary reasonable modifications. So this is kind of what you think of when you wheelchair ramps, grab bars, door peepholes, widening doors, changing the doorknobs from one that's round to one that's a lever for people who have physical disabilities. But it's anything that's a physical structure change that the person with a disability needs in their unit to be able to live there. Now, these modifications are kind of a common misconception that we see people have is landlords are only required to allow these modifications. They're not required to pay for them. So tenants are usually the ones that have to pay for these modifications. The one exception would be if the landlord receives federal government funding, then the housing provider is the one that's required to pay for that. But if it's just market rate complex, or if it's they don't get federal funding, then the tenant can be required to pay. We are aware of some funding through the city and the county that helps people with disabilities, sometimes helps them pay for these modifications. So there are some exceptions or exemptions, very, very little to these fair housing laws. These fair housing laws, like on the laws, like I said, they do have exemptions and exceptions and different interpretations based on where the country the person is, and it is considered on a case-by-case basis. But in California, the exemptions on like who is covered, what type of housing provider is covered, it's pretty minimal. So it doesn't just apply to like large complexes or large landlords. It can apply to someone who's renting out a single home to an individual. Most of these laws also apply to those type of housing providers as well. And so, but every situation, you know, is different and unique, and likely a lawyer would help understanding and asserting your rights in this context. And so here at GBLA, we provide these services. We're funded to provide these services. We cover most of the county, everything in the county except for the cities and the localities in North Kern. That's covered by a different agency. We have 3 primary functions. The first one is basically this: we provide community education and outreach. We regularly make presentations throughout the county to community members, to community groups, to housing providers. We also attend outreach events, although less so during COVID. But historically, we've attended outreach events to kind of educate the community about these laws, about our services. We also investigate allegations of housing discrimination. So we, like I alluded to earlier, we do have a hotline here at GBLA, at the Fair Housing Law Project, that people call in, and we screen for fair housing cases. And so the ones that sound like it could be housing discrimination, we set appointments up to meet with an attorney, to interview them, kind of figure out what's going on, review documents, interview witnesses, and then try to determine whether there's any evidence of housing discrimination. In addition to kind of investigating individual complaints, complaints that come in, sometimes we look at potential housing discrimination that's not based on an individual complaint, but based on other factors. We do have a testing program, which is kind of like a secret shopper program, but for housing. And so what this is we have testers who are volunteers specifically trained to do this kind of work. They go out in pairs to a housing provider, and they go inquiring about a unit that's available. And then the testers are given, the same characteristics, except for the one thing that we're testing. So like, if we're doing a test based on race, then one of the testers would be white, one would be black, or one would be white, and one would be Hispanic tester. If we're doing testing on disability, maybe one tester would have an emotional support animal, and one would not, or one would have a Section 8 voucher and one wouldn't. And then what we do is we compare the information that's given to each tester. We are actually always looking for volunteer testers. And if you're interested in doing that, please contact us. It is a valuable tool that fair housing organizations have to be able to find where there's housing discrimination, because really it's sometimes it's difficult to know why people are doing the things that they do if you don't have something to compare it to. So for instance, if someone gets denied housing or is told that they don't housing isn't available, a lot of times the person's not going to know that housing was available unless there's somebody else who comes in and is told something different. So really testing is a valuable tool that we have, and like I said, we're always looking for testers. Finally, when we find evidence of housing discrimination, we do provide enforcement services. And so by either advocating for our client's interest with the landlord, or if that doesn't work, that's kind of our first preference. If that doesn't work, then we file complaints with HUD, which is the federal agency that enforces these rules, or the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, which is the California state agency that handles these complaints, or by filing a lawsuit. So this is the various ways that you can contact us for services. Either through, like I said, we have a phone line. You can call us. We have a website, or by email. We have a website, gblafairhousing.org, that has actually a lot of information, basically everything that I covered, but in there's each category, there's some stuff in more detail. You know, a lot of examples of kind of what of the different categories that I covered briefly here. And then that's our address. We're currently not accepting walk-in appointments, but you can always call us, email us. And then all this information is, you know, like Cassie said, it's posted on our social media pages and webpage and such.
Thank you so much for all that information, Bashar. I'm going to go ahead and open this up now to questions. At this time, you can either raise your hand, type in the chat box, or type your question in the question box, and we'll give just a few moments. So I don't have anything else popping up at this time in terms of questions. If at any point you do feel that there's a question that may have came up that you would like to have addressed, please feel free to either reach out, as Bashar said, the contact information on the screen here, GBLA fairhousing.org is the website, or you can reach by email. You can also send that information directly to me in response to the webinar follow-up email that comes. So I don't see any questions. I don't see any hands up. So we'll go ahead and wrap up today. Thank you so much for joining us today for Third Thursday with GBLA. This is a monthly webinar series. I unfortunately do not have the next topic up for you, but trust and believe that we will have some great information coming out in May. And so until then, we'll see you later, and thank you for joining us.